Welcome to this webinar on supplier engagement, where we're going to talk about the process of supplier engagement, but as well the why of supplier engagement. Why should you involve yourself with engaging suppliers for sustainability information? And two main reasons are reducing financial risk and hitting your reduction targets. We will dive into this a bit more in following slides. But before we get started, I want to quickly talk about who we are. I am Maarten de Groos. I am the marketing lead for Climate Camp. And today I'm joined by Jonas, who is sitting next to me, who is a supplier onboarding specialist. He is actually the more senior expert in supplier engagement, because Jonas has helped and performed over 800, 900, I forgot the number, of suppliers to engage them for primary data. He helped reach out to them, book meetings, and gather their data, validate it as well. So he is tried and true in this process. Later on in the presentation, he will give some tips and tricks on what goes well, what you need to take into account when forming supplier engagements. Now, what are we going to talk about today? First, we're going to start out with what is supplier engagement. I think it's important to quickly establish what this process is and then move on to why. Why should you engage your suppliers? As Simon Sinek always says, start with why or focus on the why. And it comes down to three things. Most emissions come from a scope 3, but this ties into the following two reasons, the main reasons for doing supplier engagement, which is to reduce upstream price increases, which you are now not aware of, as well as hitting your customers and your own reduction targets. Afterwards, we're going to dive into the process of how you are going to tackle supplier engagement. We'll focus on how you do hotspot analysis, data cleaning and enrichment, how the outreach process should be handled, as well as how data gets validated and integrated into your scope 3, into your reduction targets, into supplier maturity. And finally, we're going to quickly touch on supplier enablement to increase supplier maturity over time. During the webinar, if you have questions, there is a chat. I can see it right now, but it is on top of the Microsoft Teams browser. There is a chat where you can post your questions, and there is also a Q&A section where you can ask questions. If there are any questions, we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. Now, what is supplier engagement? Supplier engagement actually has to do with much more than just sustainability. It actually refers to a series of activities and tactics designed to strengthen and deepen the relationship with incumbent suppliers. So it has to do with much more than sustainability, but today it is very much used to talk about sustainability topics. Why? Because a lot of sustainability topics have to do with your value chain. Today, we're going to talk about carbon and the effects it has on supplier relationships, but water usage for CSRD, for example, like child labor, these types of topics all relate to your value chain and tracking data, traceability, for example, for deforestation as well. So there is a much higher need to collaborate within your value chain. So supplier engagement today often gets primarily used for supplier sustainability topics and exchanging information. Now, when we're talking about sustainability maturity, in this case, scope 3 or carbon maturity, we see it as a process where you increase your maturity over time. This graph is similar to what consultants might use, what other tools might use. When we talk about carbon maturity and increasing it, it is a step-by-step process. Now, we are going to focus on scope 3 because suppliers are what is part of your scope 3 or what make up your scope 3, and also what we at Climate Camp focus on. So for companies, our customers, suppliers of our customers, they are often on this trajectory. For most companies, scope 1 and 2 calculations is what they have already done. They have done it last year, the year before, maybe even 5 to 10 years ago. So that is when they have not started. But the first step in scope 3 is obviously doing a full corporate carbon footprint calculation. So also including scope 3 using industry average emission factors. So this is the first step that people will take in scope 3. And they will also, what we see with our customers and prospects, is do some priority PCF calculations. What does this mean? If you have a very important customer and this customer purchases one specific product, then sometimes PCF calculations only happen for this product, which represents maybe 30, 20, 40% of total revenue. It could also be that your company doesn't have 100 different types of products. Then priority PCFs might just be calculated because you don't have that many different products. After calculation for corporate carbon footprint and product carbon footprint, we'll move on to supplier engagements. Now, we have engage here and target next. We often see these two as interchangeable. Some companies set reduction targets first, but the reason why we always focus, or we always mention to start with supplier engagement first, is you want to set targets which are realistic. It's a hard effort to reduce 4.2% every year. So it's better that your targets are correct, and primary data from suppliers can heavily improve this variance you have in calculating your CCF and PCF. That's why we always say engage is the step that people take after doing a full corporate carbon footprint, because it can help you set more accurate targets and more realistic reduction targets in the future. And afterwards, you obviously launch reduction initiatives. Now, why should you engage your suppliers? This will be the red thread throughout a lot of things what Climate Camp talks about. Scope 3 is responsible for 80 to 90% of your emissions. I've listed here a graph from CDP, an analysis performed a couple of years ago, which showcases the distribution of Scope 1, 2, and 3 for different companies. And as you can see, orange is ever so present for all of these sectors, with the exemption of very high energy sectors such as cement, such as electric utilities, energy production. But for all other sectors, Scope 3 is 80 to 90% of your corporate carbon footprint. So that is not necessarily the reason why you should engage your suppliers, but it leans into the following subject, which is there are going to be a lot more carbon taxes and compliance costs, which will drive upstream supply chain costs. Maybe you are not an energy producer, maybe you are not a transportation company, maybe you do not create glass, ceramics, paper, and aluminum, but they are present in your supply chain, in your value chain. So depending on which suppliers you work with, the transportation routes which are being taken, the amount of energy used to produce your raw materials, there will be carbon taxes. The companies creating these products will try to sell these products at a premium to recover the costs of these carbon taxes. That has to do with EU ETS. Today, it focuses on EU ETS 1, which is energy production, maritime and air transport, as well as tax for high energy users, which I've listed here. This will also be extended with road transport, and I can assume that a lot of companies in Europe heavily use road transport to transport goods. And it will also incorporate heating from buildings as well as small energy producers, or fuel used for small energy producers. Now, that is EU ETS. That will be price increases that come to your value chain. Then we also have CBAM, which will start in a year or two, if I'm not mistaken, where they will levy an import tax for high energy goods. So when you import cement, electricity, fertilizers, iron and steel, and aluminum, and so on, you will have to pay a price premium. Simple, it's like the tariffs from Trump. It's to incentivize you not source this from outside of the EU, because it will be more expensive to create this in the EU because of these energy taxes or carbon taxes. So to level the playing field, EU will levy these import taxes to make sure that you source locally and not just circumvent carbon taxes by sourcing it from Africa or South America. We also have a bunch of upcoming regulations. I've just listed a few. There are many, many more. CSRD, VSME, the EU deforestation regulation, packaging and waste regulation, water. There are many different types of legislation and regulation coming into effect. This costs money. I talked about this topic with a sustainability director. He's like, the cost of sustainability on one part is better processes, etc., but it is also the payroll cost of everybody involved in compliance, in tracking, and improving traceability and launching these initiatives. So these costs need to be recouped somehow. So price of goods will increase, and you might wonder, okay, the price of goods might increase, but me and my competitor, we both buy glass, so why the cost will increase similarly for us? What does that mean for our financial risk? Well, that is not necessarily true. Even if you and your competitors source the same goods, let's say glass in this example, your costs can differ sharply due to if you have different suppliers and they use different energy, one is purely using renewables, another is using a gas furnace, the sustainability choices they made, how they transport their glass or the raw materials for their glass, the transport distance, do they have large transfer or complex transportation routes in your value chain, as well as if you are importing from different regions, can implicitly create a difference in costs between you and your competitor while still sourcing the same glass or the same paper or cardboard. So if you don't have visibility into your supplier's practices and the structure of your value chain, hidden costs can quickly erode your margins. If costs, depending on the makeup of your value chain, your costs are 10% higher, that will erode your margins in comparison to a competitor. So engaging suppliers exposes these risks and creates opportunities to reduce them. Now, why should you engage your suppliers? One part of it is to avoid larger costs suddenly happening when in a year or two and totally destroying your margins. The second is obviously on the other side of your value chain, which is your reduction targets, but especially your customers' reduction targets. Large retailers, large companies at the end of the value chain have set reduction targets, and under SBTi, which is the most known framework for setting reduction targets, Scope 3 targets are required if they make up more than 40% of a company's total footprint. A retailer, its footprint will be 90% Scope 3. A lot of retailers at the end of the value chain, their Scope 3 footprint will be almost entirely their total carbon footprint. And so when they set reduction targets, they must set a Scope 3 reduction target that covers 67 or 2/3 of their total Scope 3 emissions, which means they have to set a target. They might set an absolute target. They might set an intensity target. But what a lot of companies do is also set a supplier or customer engagement target. That's why I've listed the different targets here, because a supplier engagement target says if you set a Scope 3 target, you can do a supplier engagement target which focuses on pushing suppliers or customers to setting SBTi targets. So that is why I said between parentheses, hitting your customers' reduction targets or your reduction targets, because for them to reach their goals, they might come to you to set reduction targets as well. And we can also see what's next. This is not decided yet, but there might be Scope 3 targets for all large companies, even if you have less than 40% in Scope 3. There might come activity-based targets for high-impact categories. But the reason why I've listed this is especially for the last point, recognition of insetting or indirect mitigation, which means that if you help your suppliers improve their practices, like, for example, with regenerative agriculture, you will get recognized for that, and it will help you reach your reduction targets, which increases the value of engaging with suppliers. Now, I'll give two examples because this is all very theoretical and it might be like, Maarten, okay, very interesting, but who is actually doing this and why does it matter? I'll give you two examples of major corporations already doing this. IKEA is one of them. I'll list this example here. Since 2021, IKEA has collected primary electricity data from suppliers. Why? IKEA's value chain is primarily wood, plastics, and other components needed to create their furniture. So the energy their suppliers use to create their raw materials is the largest part of IKEA's footprint. So what did IKEA do? They requested primary electricity data to see who has renewable energy, who is using gas, oil, coal, or different energy sources, and then set up an entire program where they collect this data and help their suppliers with loans, with like certain agreements, power agreements, which then their suppliers can join, so they could raise the renewable electricity share from 71 to 75%. 4% might not seem much, but IKEA is gigantic, so the impact this has is humongous. The second example, a very known example, is Project Gigaton, which is Walmart, a famous and very large American retailer, which aimed to cut 1 billion metric tons of emissions from its value chain. Why do I list this example? Because it's a perfect example of supplier engagement as well. Because in Project Gigaton, they also work with financial institutions, but the suppliers of Walmart are encouraged to set science-based targets, as we mentioned before, or SBTi aligned, but they also need to report progress in different areas. Today, we are going to talk about carbon a lot, but they are requesting information on energy, waste, packaging, agriculture, different sustainability metrics, which are relevant to them. So these are very good examples of how supplier engagement is already being done by the larger retailers, the larger companies in the world. Now you might wonder, they are already doing it, why should I? Because you are maybe a tier one supplier to Walmart or some other retailer, but your value chain also consists of a lot of scope 3 emissions. So for Walmart to increase their to reduce their emissions, they need you, but you need, again, your value chain, your suppliers to reduce as well. So it's a sequential effort which then travels down the supply chain. How to engage suppliers? This is why I also involved Jonas here today. We do this process regularly with Climate Camp. We move through different steps in the supplier engagement process, and we do this with all of our customers to showcase how you can organize this process efficiently. First, you're going to do a hotspot analysis. You want to know which suppliers are responsible for, let's say, 80% of emissions if we apply Pareto. Then you need to clean data, contact data, and enrich because you might have a lot of data gaps and there is a lot of public information. And then you will start your supplier outreach plan or your activities, which consist of crafting a multi-channel engagement plan, not because I like multi-channel engagement plans, because they actually increase response rates and make sure that you get a lot of primary data. The fourth step is data validation. We might have nice numbers, or your supplier might supply nice numbers, but you need to be sure that these are actually correct, and you need contextual information to back it up. This is why we do data validation, to make sure that the data we use is actually of very good quality. And then finally, we talk about data integration. Integration into your scope 3 activity-based calculations, integration into your reduction targets and pathways, as well as to track supplier maturity. Let's get started. We'll always start with hotspot analysis. Now, hotspot analysis is just to identify the suppliers responsible for 80% of your emissions. Now, you need to know, maybe the people who are in this webinar are already engaged in the calculation of scope 3 process. Scope 3 calculation takes time, and to do it accurately takes a lot of time. It also takes efforts on the company's side to capture data they didn't do before, weigh certain products. So to finalize scope 3 calculations for larger companies, we see this takes 3 to 6 months time. If we wait until everything is completed there to start supplier engagement, you will have lost a lot of time and you might not get around to the results in time before the end of the year. So what we generally suggest is starting a parallel process. So when activity-based calculations are starting or are ongoing, you first do a spend-based calculation so you can get the suppliers responsible for 80% of emissions. Simply what you do is you track or you extract all purchases with their spend and corresponding suppliers from your CRM tool, your procurement tool, your ERP tool. You then apply spend-based emission factors for a rough footprint. This will not be as accurate, but the biggest supplier will generally still stay the biggest supplier, and this is the information we are after. The third is then we group these emissions by supplier and rank them from highest to lowest, and then you simply count up until you reach about 80% of your scope 3 emissions, especially in purchased goods and services, since this will make up 60 to 70% of your scope 3. This is what we first do, a hotspot analysis. This is how that looks like in Climate Camp, which then makes us able to start the supplier engagement process. Then we start with data cleaning and enrichment. You have this list of suppliers. Let's say you have 50 suppliers. Now you need to contact them. Now you need to find the right person. You will extract some contact information or supplier information from one of these tools, procurement, CRM, and then try to get the contacts. But in our experience, what you will generally get is very, very bad quality data. It might have email addresses, which are just invoicing addresses, info ads, finance ads, and missing telephone numbers. So you need to confirm details with the person responsible for managing the relationship, category managers, procurement managers, or research these professionals yourself. So you need to clean the data to have a successful outreach program. But on the other hand, there is a lot of sustainability information already available. I've listed a bunch of frameworks and reporting frameworks here on the right side. There are tons of legislation, ton of reporting frameworks, voluntary and mandatory, which already incentivize major corporations and a lot of corporations to to report on their carbon footprint, to report on their reduction targets. So this information will be in a sustainability report on their website, on a web page. So to save yourself some time when you're validating this data in the coming steps, it's good to already gather these sustainability reports, gather these CCF numbers, gather these reduction target numbers. So that is why we enrich with public sustainability information and clean supplier data. Now I'm going to ask Jonas if he can give us some tips and tricks when it comes to data cleaning and enrichment.
Absolutely. So yeah, happy to share some insights on how some common pitfalls that we oftentimes see and some tips on how we can avoid these regarding the topic of data cleaning and enrichment. First of all, we typically in our ERP system will have a number of contacts from our supplier or from each supplier. It's important not just to reach out to any kind of random or irrelevant people within the supplier organization, but to really target the relevant sustainability authority, which has the relevant expertise and context within the supplier's organization. For mid-corporate sized suppliers, this will typically be a sustainability director or a sustainability manager. For small or medium-sized enterprises, this would rather be the business owner or sometimes the quality manager. And this is the right person that we want to be able to get the relevant data from. Secondly, we also see a lot of the time in our own data system, we will have some outdated records. So it's important before we reach out to our suppliers that we do a good cleanup. And for example, a lot of the companies that we work with, oftentimes, we only during the reach out to suppliers, we will find out that actually some suppliers were included, which hadn't had any active purchases in the last 3 or 4 years. Obviously, there's no added value in this case to involve these suppliers. Lastly, third tip here as well, so we see especially larger organizations will have a number of different company entities. It's important that we can clearly map the parent-child structures and that we can really take this hierarchy into account before reaching out to these organizations. Typically, the reporting will be done on a group level, meaning that typically it makes sense trying to reach out to the relevant authority within the parent company. And so in this case, it's really important to take this hierarchy into account. So these are some common pitfalls and some ways you can avoid these.
Thank you, Jonas. Now you have cleaned the data, you have enriched the data with public information of these suppliers responsible for 80% of your emissions. Now, I say craft a multi-channel outreach campaign to maximize response rates. I am a marketeer. This sounds like a very marketeer statement to make, but there is a reasoning behind it. Some of you may have been confronted with the first efforts of these corporates trying supplier engagement. And what they did, like large retailers, for example, they sent a questionnaire. This questionnaire has 50 questions. And then they are surprised that they only got a response rate of 10 or 15%. First off, why is that? Well, for your entire value chain, 10, 15, 20% might actually know what you are talking about, might have carbon data. There are large corporates, they already calculated this, for example, or you directly have the right person who knows what you're talking about. But what generally happens is mails get lost, people are on holiday, the data in your system is still incorrect, somebody changed their job, or what most of the time happens is for smaller companies, they don't have carbon data, they didn't calculate it yet, or they only have a certain data point, but not all of it. So when we say craft a multi-channel outreach campaign, it's just to increase your success. If you spend all this effort to then get a 5% response rate with bad quality data, well, then it's a very bad ROI to do supplier engagement. So make sure you don't set yourself up for failure and really think about how you will handle this outreach. So to make it work, Jonas will give some very specific tips related to this as well. But to make outreach actually work well, you need to make the expectations easy for suppliers to understand. What do you need from them? By when? What are the implications of filling this questionnaire or not filling this out. Schedule validation meetings. If you think 50 questions is a lot, there is a lot more contextual information to go over. So it helps to have these short 30-minute meetings to quickly ask follow-up questions. And here we're only talking about carbon. This will only increase when you add in water usage, when you add in other sustainability topics for CSRD, such as child labor, like all these topics, all these data points. Schedule meetings. 30-minute meetings will help clarify things for your suppliers, and it will increase the data quality. And also reserve more time for unaware suppliers. 10% of your value chain, 20% of your value chain might already know about these topics or have carbon data. 80% won't and will need help. Then you could also integrate these carbon questions into contract negotiations or procurement. Larger companies who work with procurement managers or category managers, you should help them, educate them, involve yourself in their contract negotiations, because this is a good moment to talk about these requirements moving forward. If they don't have carbon data yet, you can maybe talk about how they can invest efforts here in the future. Jonas, could you tell me a bit more about how you make it work, the supplier outreach?
Absolutely. Happy to add some flavor to the topic. First of all, we believe when reaching out to suppliers, a lot of them will be very new to this type of request or exercise. And this means that we really want to have as good of a first impression as possible. And one of the ways to do this is to really leverage the authority that you have as being a customer. So typically, we really also recommend our customers for the first message to the suppliers to be sent from the category or purchasing manager or even the CEO to clearly show the priority and importance that this topic has for our organization. Secondly, it's important to be mindful of the timing of our supplier outreach, depending on your industry and also the industries of your suppliers. There might be different peak seasons. So it's important that we can respect the calendars and anticipate when our suppliers might have a little bit extra time to take on some new types of requests. We also see that it typically works best if we can communicate a clear deadline towards suppliers. This just helps with aligning expectations and creating a clearer sense of urgency and a structure to collaborate on. Thirdly, we also see that it's important that we don't just send out messages to all our suppliers. They might feel like just being a number. So we really highly recommend to segment our supplier base. We can do this based on supplier size, their strategic importance, their language, but even their assessed sustainability maturity and how much hand-holding they might need from our side. Secondly, we can also personalize our communication with the suppliers, referencing our unique relationship history with them. A fourth tip I would still like to add as well is oftentimes suppliers will have a lot of questions. They might have some concerns, some pushback on being asked a lot of questions about their sustainability, their carbon data, and so on. It's important that our team, everyone from our company who will be handling and working on the topic of supplier outreach, will be on the same page, and that we beforehand can anticipate what concerns might come up and what are our organization's answers to those frequently asked questions or objections. Some ones that we come across very often would be any relevant costs that might be there, anything related to how much time is also required from the supplier's side, and how we as a customer go about confidentiality. So again, I think this slide is just one example of a few different objections and the types of responses that we typically might prepare ourselves. It's important, obviously, that this is further customized to your organization But again, you'll see a lot of your suppliers will have the same types of questions and objections. So it's good to anticipate those and make sure your organization is on the same page when it comes to handling all these questions and objections.
All right, thank you, Jonas. Something I didn't mention on the slides, but which I'm going to mention here now, what is also really good in the supplier outreach process is that you track how the success of the outreach program goes. So for all the suppliers you invite, how many went into calls, how many rejected your information. For example, in ClimateCamp today, you can see when you do supplier engagement, how many requests have been sent, how many are in active outreach. This is a demo account, so here we're not actively doing supplier engagement. But so you can see when you do the process again next year, if you have improved, if more companies have shared information, if they have increased the data share that they are sharing with you, that they move from CCF to PCF or reduction targets, so that you can measure the success of your supplier. I quickly wanted to show this because we recently released this in ClimateCamp, but you can track this with a lot more effort, but in Excel as well. So let me quickly go back to the presentation. All right. After we've done supplier outreach, let's assume that Jonas did a great job and he got a lot of suppliers to step into meetings to validate the information. Then that is already a really good success. But organizing these data validation meetings in an efficient manner and an effective manner is also really important. Your supplier has a lot of things to do. You have a lot of things to do. You have many suppliers to do these data validation calls with. So when you step into these calls to increase their effectiveness, go over these contextual questions. Yes, you will have a CCF number. Yes, you will have a scope 1, 2, 3 number from maybe a sustainability report. But when you dive into it, first clarify the organizational structure of the company, your supplier's company. There are always more subsidiaries than you know of. There are always more, or a parent company or a different structure. It's not really known, easy to interpret from the sustainability report. So you should clarify this so you can really understand how our organizational boundary sets, equity share, financial control, operational control, as well as where do we need to allocate these emissions, because you might be purchasing from different entities within the same group with different PCFs or different CCF numbers. So to properly allocate data later, you really need to understand the organizational data. So you also need to cross-check the data you collected via sustainability reports. You will have reduction target information, you will have CCF information, but validate it with the person you are talking to, because this might have changed. Especially with reduction targets, often things change in the commitment phase. Then we go towards validating corporate carbon footprint. What you should always ask is which categories are included in scope 1, 2, 3. 1 and 2 is generally straightforward, but in scope 3, we see a lot of variance. Most companies do purchase goods and services. Most companies do transportation. But when we start talking about end of life, waste, employee commute, business travel, not all companies track this or report on this. So check which categories are included. For scope 2, check if there was a market-based or location-based method used for calculating the purchased electricity or heating or other energy source. And for scope 3, we mentioned this in the beginning of the webinar. Did they use spend-based emission factors? Did they use activity-based emission factors or calculation method? Or did they use a hybrid method within their scope 3? This will heavily influence the accuracy of their results and will help you evaluate if you should integrate these numbers directly into your results. And then finally, has the CCF been audited or verified by a third party? I think Jonas will come back to this. Verification is important to validate, to make sure the numbers are correct, not because your supplier wants to create problems or doesn't really understand how to do carbon calculations, but mistakes happen. It helps that that's why CSRD requires limited assurance. It's to ensure that these numbers are correct, especially when they get integrated into your scope 3, because then you are also responsible for these numbers. This is relevant for CCF, but the same applies for PCF and reduction targets. When we look towards product carbon footprint, When we talk about categories in scope 3, we talk about system boundaries and PCF. So check cradle to gate to gate, which system boundaries were applied, which production steps and processes are included in this life cycle, and is the PCF reported for an individual product, so for a single unit, or what we more often see is for batches or functional units, X amount of liters, X amount of kilograms, 150 units because it concerns a certain batch. Check on what the PCF reports specifically, as well as can they provide documentation so you can check it later and provide an audit trail. For reduction targets, you will talk about or ask for what baseline year was chosen and why, the types of targets which are set. I mentioned them before, absolute intensity-based supplier engagement, but they can mix and match these as well, so really dive into this. And also, are these targets aligned with something like SBTI, or if they are independent targets? And do they also have a reduction action plan in place? Jonas, can you tell me a bit more about that validation, how to really do it properly?
Yes, happy to add some more hard-learned lessons here. First of all, really in line with what you already mentioned, Maarten, is we really want to emphasize the importance of requesting the relevant documentation. Typically, when we will ask our suppliers to fill in a survey, an Excel file, or a platform like Climate Camp, there's always a risk of some data input errors or mistakes. This is why we really want to emphasize that we want to collect audit reports when they're available, any certificates for CCF or PCF, or any additional evidence that ensures the accuracy of the reported numbers by our suppliers, because this also leaves a clear audit trail as well. Secondly, a common pitfall is that we see that companies will not always use benchmarks in order to do a rough sanity check of the data that we get from our suppliers. It's important that we really try to use external references to really check the credibility. Does this data make sense? For example, when one of our suppliers provides us with an intensity-based corporate carbon footprint, we might want to compare this with the intensity-based corporate carbon footprint of their industry peers. Another example, if another supplier has their own calculated product carbon footprints, we don't want to just start using those in our own calculations. We first want to compare those with the industry average emission factors, so we can really have a clear understanding of what is the percentage difference between their reported product carbon footprint and the activity-based industry average emission factor we would otherwise use. So we can again see if this deviates a lot, and we really want to challenge the supplier on why their number is so much higher or so much lower than what we would otherwise expect from the industry average, and to really make sure that they have the relevant documentation to substantiate their reported data. Lastly, is also again we see a common pitfall for organizations is to really dive into the data validation topic during the final sprint towards the reporting deadline or the audit deadline. And so we think it's important to really embed the data validation into your process. We can really build these sanity checks into our workflows. We can use the momentum of being in contact with our suppliers to really make sure that we are confident in the data that we've collected and the data that they enter, and we can still use our conversations with the supplier to challenge them, so we can really catch mistakes early upfront, rather than finding any last-minute surprises right before any kind of reporting deadline. So yeah, these I think are some general takeaways that I believe add a lot of extra value to the quality of the collected data.
Yeah, very often we see like it's not that somebody has bad intentions, but export functionality is often faulty in whatever tools you might use. Dots and commas get misplaced all the time and mean different in different number systems. And on another note, improving your calculations is something that improves year over year. So the accuracy also improves year over year. If this is the first year a supplier is doing a scope 3 calculation or maybe a scope 1 and 2 calculation, they will make mistakes. They will omit certain data. They might miss something if they do it themselves, or the consultant might miss something. Error is human, is normal, but trying to circumvent error as much as possible is really becoming important when you are starting to audit, having to be audited and to report it externally. So really take this at face value that you need to do data validation, as Jonas said, early enough, because if you are all going to do it in December, there are not enough working days in December to right all these wrongs. Now we're going to talk about data integration. You have had a great campaign. You have the emissions data, the primary data from your suppliers. You had a good outreach. You got a lot of data validation calls. All your contextual questions are answered. Now it's time to do something with this data, obviously. But there is a difference between the data points which you can integrate into Scope 3 reduction targets and other data points such as supplier maturity. Now, we've talked about this in the beginning. You do Scope 3 calculations. You do a quick spend-based emission factor allocation to estimate which are your biggest emitting suppliers. And then you start with activity-based calculations so you can integrate the supplier-specific data at a later point. Now, you have completed your activity-based calculations and you organize the data by weight. Now you can enter the supplier data. And you will have one of two options, what most companies do. If you have a PCF for your specific product creates, you can just multiply the supplied PCF by the purchased weight and you will have a very accurate number. Realistically, 90% of your suppliers, the smaller suppliers, will only deliver CCF information. And then a lot of companies apply an intensity-based emission factor, which Jonas mentioned before, where you take CCF, corporate carbon footprint, you normalize it versus the revenue of the company. So you get an intensity-based emission factor, which says euro per kilogram CO2 equivalent. And then you just apply it to how much you spent on the supplier. Not the most accurate, no, but more accurate than having no data at all. So integrating this data in Scope 3 can be done with PCF, can be done with CCF. It can also be done with integrating, if they have reduction targets, integrating them into your reduction targets. However, this is the webinar in and of itself. Integrating and simulating reduction targets of your suppliers into your own reduction pathways is a very complex subject, but it is possible. Now, this is data that can be integrated. We also talk about data points which cannot be integrated, but serve a different purpose. So what are we talking about? Supplier maturity. So when you set a supplier engagement target for SBTI, or even if you have absolute or intensity-based Scope 3 targets, you want to track that your suppliers are increasing their carbon maturity. Scope 1 and 2 calculations, Scope 3 calculations, integrating supplier-specific data, setting reduction targets. You need to track this so you can track how they are performing year over year. I have talked to many retailers and sustainability people at retailers. This is an actual track they are doing, tracking sustainability maturity, seeing how they are increasing over time. So this is not data you specifically integrate into something. It's more you can do this with an Excel as well, which lists all your suppliers, which lists different levels of maturity, and that you can see in 2023, they were at this maturity levels, this many were at level 3, at level 4, at level 5. Then the next year you can report on, we increased supplier maturity by this much by tracking it. So that's how we do data integration. Now, we're talking a lot about data, about Scope 3 data, about exchanging information between supplier and customer, but the goal is always reduction. The goal is always getting everybody's Scope 3 down, getting a smaller number over time. So you also need to enable your suppliers. I've mentioned the examples in the beginning of IKEA and of Walmart. Microsoft does this as well. I know some other, Unilever also has programs which enable suppliers to take action. Why? These large companies have more resources, but they are dependent on their supply chain to reduce Scope 3. So having a collaboration that goes further than just data exchange is what we are talking about when we're talking about supplier enablement. Now, what does supplier enablement mean? There are different things. Some of these projects we do with customers as well. For example, actively helping suppliers in calculating PCFs. For example, you are a larger company, you have small suppliers, you help a set of key suppliers calculate the PCFs for the products you purchase. This is supplier enablement. You can offer tools and guidance. I've seen examples of providing documentation, providing tools, for example, or for our customers, we provide our tool for free to their suppliers to provide consultancy hours, like creating systems of support for your suppliers to calculate CCF, to calculate PCF, to set reduction targets. But a very important one, and this is outside of something that ClimateScam does, but it is really important, is provide sales incentives for carbon maturity. The conversations we often have with prospects is, we do this because you're an important customer, so that is step one. But increasing carbon maturity often comes down to, can you incentivize me with long-term contracts, or will you incorporate carbon as an RFP variable, for example, to make it worth it for me? If I invest in sustainability, will it pay in the long run when you buy certain goods from me? So sales incentives is one part of supplier enablement. The other is setting up a framework for sustainability-linked loans. What does this mean? Coca-Cola does this, for example. It means that suppliers can get preferential interest rates on certain loans for coupled to their ESG ratings, for example. So like having a financial structure for these investments where they will be scored on ESG metrics. And we also have investing in insetting projects within your value chain. This might be added to SBTi reduction targets as well. But if you work together with your value chain to invest in regenerative agriculture and diversifying the goods, increasing the recycled content of your raw materials, then this can qualify as an insetting project as well. This is the final slide before I'm going to talk about our coming webinar, but I first want to thank everybody for joining us for the supplier engagement webinar. I want to thank Jonas for giving his insights when he is doing this process each and every week. If there are questions, I'm going to look in a minute. If there are, please do ask them now. And before we go to the questions, I quickly wanted to delve into what we are going to talk about in our next webinar. It's going to be a bit more nitty-gritty again. This was more high-level supplier engagement. The next webinar is up and downstream transportation. I can assure you, very complex. It has a lot of nuance to it, to how you calculate scope 3, category 4 and 9 for up and downstream transportation. I will do that with my colleague Ruben, who is head of customer success and heavily involved in this topic. So let me quickly see, are there any questions? I'll quickly stop sharing. I see Jessica is typing, so I'm going to quickly wait. I'm looking for, okay, perfect. Thank you. Are there any other questions? I'm going to give it a couple more seconds before I will close the webinar. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. I will share the presentation afterwards. If you have input on which topics you would like us to cover in upcoming webinars, please do. And just as Jessica, I'm also looking forward to the next webinar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.